They found the convoy at dawn, or what was left of it. 17 trucks, 2 artillery pieces, and 1 Type 95 Hago light tank, all reduced to twisted metal and ash along a muddy jungle road in the Philippines. Captain James Morrison had seen plenty of carnage in his 3 years in the Pacific, but nothing quite like this. The Japanese column had been annihilated with surgical precision, yet there were no signs of American forces anywhere in the region. No shell casings from infantry weapons. No bomb craters from aerial attack. Just destruction, complete and absolute.
"Sir, you need to see this," called Sergeant Peters, his voice carrying a strange mixture of disbelief and awe. Morrison walked through the carnage, stepping over bodies frozen in expressions of terror and, oddly, laughter. Yes, laughter. Several of the dead Japanese soldiers had died with smiles still etched on their faces, their features twisted into macabre grins that would haunt Morrison's dreams for years to come.
Peters pointed to a set of tracks in the mud. Tank tracks, but unlike any Morrison had ever seen. They were narrow, almost delicate, the treads of something impossibly small.
"What the hell made those?" Morrison whispered. The story of what happened on that road, and the remarkable machine and the even more remarkable man who operated it, would become one of the most classified secrets of World War II. For 80 years, it remained buried in sealed archives, dismissed as impossible, relegated to the realm of wartime myth and propaganda. Until now.
This is the true story of the M22 Locust, the tank they called ridiculous, and the soldier who turned it into the deadliest weapon the Japanese Imperial Army never saw coming.
Fort Knox, Kentucky, March 1943. The officers gathered around the new arrival like surgeons examining a particularly disappointing patient. At just over 12 feet long and barely 8 feet wide, the M22 Locust looked less like a weapon of war and more like someone's idea of a cruel joke. "Is this a tank?" drawled Colonel Harrison, "or did someone shrink a real one in the wash?" Laughter rippled through the assembled brass. The M22 sat there, seemingly absorbing their mockery, its 37mm gun pointed forward like a defiant finger. At 7.4 tons, it was lighter than most trucks. Its armor, at its thickest point, was barely an inch, enough to stop rifle fire, but anything heavier would punch through like paper. "Gentlemen," said Major Theodore Weston, the project liaison from the Armor Development Center, "I understand your skepticism, but this vehicle was designed with a specific purpose in mind. It's an airborne tank, capable of being transported by glider directly into combat zones. What it lacks in armor, it makes up for in mobility, and—" "Mobility?" Colonel Harrison snorted. "Major, I've seen washing machines with more combat potential. The Germans would use this thing for target practice. The Japanese would probably laugh themselves to death before we could even fire a shot."
More laughter. Major Weston's face reddened, but he held his composure.
"Perhaps, sir, but in the right hands, with the right tactics, this washing machine might surprise you." Standing in the back of the crowd, unnoticed by the officers, was a young sergeant named Thomas "Tommy" Chen. At 5'4", Tommy was used to being overlooked. The son of Chinese immigrants who had settled in San Francisco's Chinatown, he had faced discrimination his entire life, from schoolyard bullies who mocked his size and heritage, to army recruiters who had initially tried to assign him to a laundry unit. But Tommy Chen had a gift. He could drive anything with wheels or tracks, and he could shoot, really shoot. In training exercises at Fort Benning, he had recorded the highest gunnery scores in his class, compensating for his small stature with an almost supernatural ability to calculate angles, distances, and trajectories in his head.
Looking at the M22 Locust, Tommy didn't see a joke. He saw himself, small, underestimated, written off before given a chance to prove what he could do.
He saw potential. "Excuse me, Major," Tommy said, stepping forward. Several officers turned, their expressions ranging from surprise to disdain at the interruption. "Permission to speak, sir?" Major Weston looked at the young sergeant with curiosity. "Go ahead, son."
"That tank, sir, What's its top speed?
40 miles per hour on roads, about 25 cross-country. Tommy's eyes widened. That was nearly twice the speed of a Sherman. And the turret traverse? Full 360 degrees in under 15 seconds. The controls are extremely responsive. Had to be for airborne operations where split-second decisions matter. Tommy nodded slowly, his mind already racing with possibilities. Sir, if no one else wants it, I'd like to volunteer for this program.
Colonel Harrison laughed outright. Perfect. The runt of the litter for the runt of a tank. Major, I think we've found your crew.
The mockery stung, but Tommy had learned long ago to convert pain into fuel. He met the colonel's eyes without flinching. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down.
He meant it as a statement of determination. Looking back, it was also a prophecy.
The next 6 months were a crucible. Tommy was assigned to a specially formed experimental unit, the 151st Airborne Tank Platoon, consisting of 4 M22 Locusts and their crews. Their mission? To prove the concept of airborne armor or die trying.
Tommy's crew consisted of 2 other men who, like him, had been passed over by conventional tank units. Private First Class Robert Bobby Washington was a black soldier from Alabama, a mechanical genius who could repair an engine by sound alone, but who had been relegated to motor pool duty because of the color of his skin.
Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos was a Mexican-American from Texas who had been a champion marksman in civilian life, but had been denied a spot in the Army's elite sniper program.
3 men, 3 outcasts, 1 tiny tank.
"Well, gentlemen," Tommy said when they first assembled beside their assigned Locust, "looks like we got the vehicle nobody wants."
"Story of my life," Bobby muttered, running his hand along the tank's armor with the tenderness of a father touching his child's face. "But you know what? My grandmother always said, 'Bobby, it ain't the size of the dog in the fight.'"
"It's the size of the fight in the dog," Miguel finished. "My abuela said the same thing. Probably said it better in Spanish."
Tommy smiled. Let's give this dog some teeth. They trained relentlessly, pushing the little tank to its limits and beyond. Tommy discovered that the M22's small size wasn't just a limitation, it was a superpower. Where larger tanks were confined to roads and open terrain, the Locust could navigate through dense forest, slip through gaps and obstacles, and hide in positions that would be impossible for a Sherman or a Pershing. He developed what he called ambush doctrine, using the Locust's speed and maneuverability to strike from unexpected angles, deliver devastating fire, and disappear before the enemy could respond. In training exercises against units equipped with larger tanks, Tommy's crew achieved a kill ratio that seemed impossible, 17 kills without a single loss.
"You're cheating," accused Lieutenant Patterson, commander of the opposing force, after Tommy's Locust had destroyed 3 of his Shermans in a single engagement.
How? Tommy asked innocently.
You're not fighting fair. You're hiding in bushes, attacking from the rear, refusing to engage head-on like a real tank.
Tommy shrugged. With respect, sir, I don't think the enemy is going to care about fair when the shooting starts. Major Weston, who had observed the exercise, stepped in. Lieutenant, Sergeant Chen is demonstrating exactly what this vehicle was designed for, asymmetric warfare, using unconventional tactics to overcome conventional disadvantages. He turned to Tommy. But I'm curious, Sergeant, what would you do if you encountered a truly overwhelming force, say an entire convoy?
Tommy was quiet for a moment, his eyes taking on a distant look that his crew would come to recognize as his calculating face. The bigger the force, sir, the more confident they become. Confidence breeds carelessness. Carelessness creates opportunities. He paused. I'd let them see me, let them laugh, and then I'd make them stop laughing.
Major Weston nodded slowly. "Remind me never to underestimate you, Sergeant Chen."
"That's what I'm counting on, sir. That's exactly what I'm counting on."
November 1944. The Philippines. General MacArthur had returned, as promised, and the bloody campaign to liberate the islands from Japanese occupation was in full swing. Tommy's unit, now designated the 151st Independent Armored Reconnaissance Platoon, was deployed to Leyte,
tasked with a mission that no other unit would accept. Japanese forces were using a network of jungle roads to move supplies and reinforcements to the front lines. These roads were too narrow for conventional tanks, too well defended for infantry alone, and too concealed by jungle canopy for effective airstrikes. For weeks, American forces had tried and failed to interdict these supply lines.
"The brass wants us to do the impossible," Captain Morrison, newly assigned to oversee the platoon, said during the briefing. "Get in there, hit their convoys, and get out without being destroyed. Personally, I think they're sending us to die." "With respect, sir," Tommy replied, "that's what everyone always thinks about us, and we're still here." The platoon moved out at dusk, 4 tiny tanks slipping into the jungle like predators entering their natural habitat. Tommy had insisted on a night approach. The Japanese wouldn't expect armor in the dark, and the Locust's relatively quiet engine would be masked by the cacophony of jungle sounds. For 3 days, they stalked the jungle roads, observing enemy patterns, identifying choke points, and planning. Tommy was meticulous, almost obsessive in his preparations. He sketched maps from memory, calculated firing solutions for every possible engagement point, and drilled his crew until they could respond to his commands by instinct alone. "You're crazy, you know that?" Bobby said on the 3rd night as they huddled in their camouflaged position, watching a Japanese patrol pass within 50 feet of their hidden tank. "Probably," Tommy admitted, "but we're about to do something no one thinks is possible. When we succeed, they'll call us heroes. If we fail, they'll call us fools. Same action, different outcome. So let's make sure we succeed." On the 4th day, Tommy identified the perfect target, a major supply convoy scheduled to pass through a narrow ravine the following morning. Intelligence, gathered by their own observation, indicated it would include at least 15 trucks, multiple artillery pieces, and possibly a tank escort. Against a force like that, 4 M22 Locusts should have been hopelessly outmatched. But Tommy had a plan.
"We're not going to fight them," he explained to his skeptical crew and the commanders of the other 3 tanks. "We're going to destroy them. There's a difference."
He laid out his plan using sticks and leaves on the jungle floor. 2 tanks would position at opposite ends of the ravine, blocking escape. The other 2 would take elevated positions on the ravine walls, hidden by foliage but with clear firing lines. When the convoy entered the kill zone, they would seal it like a bottle and systematically eliminate every vehicle inside. "It's insane," said Sergeant Williams, commander of the 2nd tank. "If anything goes wrong."
"Nothing will go wrong," Tommy said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. "Because they're going to underestimate us. They're going to see small tanks and they're going to laugh. And by the time they stop laughing, it'll be over."
Dawn broke over the Philippine jungle in shades of gold and crimson, painting the sky in colors that seemed far too beautiful for what was about to happen. Tommy's tank was positioned at the northern end of the ravine, partially hidden behind a fallen tree that provided both concealment and cover. Through his periscope, he could see the road stretching south, disappearing around a curve where the convoy would first appear.
His hands were steady on the controls. They always were, just before combat. A strange calm that descended over him like a protective shell, slowing time and sharpening his senses to an almost supernatural degree.
"Contact," Miguel's voice came through the intercom, calm and professional. "Lead vehicles coming around the bend. Account." Holy Mother of God. "How many?"
17 trucks, 2 artillery pieces on tows. Wait, there's a tank. Type 95 Ha-Go, bringing up the rear. Tommy processed this information instantly. The Type 95 was the Japanese equivalent of the M22, a light tank with thin armor and a 37mm gun. An even fight, theoretically. But the Ha-Go was at the rear of the convoy, which meant it would be the last to enter the kill zone and the first to attempt escape when the ambush was sprung.
"Williams," Tommy said into the radio, "that Ha-Go is your primary target. The moment we spring the trap, take it out. Can't let it withdraw and bring reinforcements."
The convoy crawled forward, seemingly in no particular hurry. Tommy could see Japanese soldiers riding on the trucks, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Some were eating, A few appeared to be sleeping. They were deep in their own territory, on a road they had used 100 times before, with no reason to expect danger.
That was about to change.
The lead truck reached the midpoint of the ravine, then the second, then the third. Tommy waited, counting, his finger hovering over the trigger. He needed the entire convoy inside the trap before he could close it.
15 trucks. 16. The first artillery piece. The second. And finally, the Ha-Go tank. Its commander standing in the open turret hatch, scanning the road ahead with binoculars. Tommy keyed his radio. All units, execute.
What happened next unfolded in a kind of terrible ballet, each movement precise, each action flowing seamlessly into the next.
Tommy's tank roared out of its hiding position, engines screaming as it accelerated to block the northern exit. Simultaneously, Sergeant Williams' tank emerged at the southern end, its gun already tracking toward the Ha-Go. The two elevated tanks, commanded by Sergeants Morrison and Peters, opened fire from their hidden positions on the ravine walls.
The first shot, from Miguel's gun, hit the lead truck directly in the engine block. The vehicle exploded in a fireball that sent debris scattering across the road and ignited the truck immediately behind it. 2 down in the first second.
The Japanese reaction was exactly what Tommy had predicted. Initial shock, followed by confusion, followed by the worst possible tactical decision. Instead of immediately returning fire or attempting to break through the roadblocks, the convoy stopped. Soldiers poured out of the trucks, looking around wildly, trying to identify the source of the attack. And then, incredibly, impossibly, they saw Tommy's tank. Sitting in the road, small and absurd-looking, its tiny gun pointed at them with almost comical menace.
And they laughed.
Tommy heard it through the open hatch of his tank, the unmistakable sound of human laughter echoing off the ravine walls. Japanese soldiers were pointing at his Locust, their faces split with genuine amusement. Even the Ha-Go commander, recovering from his initial surprise, allowed himself a smile as he shouted orders to his crew.
Kodomo Sensha, someone yelled. Child tank.
The phrase was picked up by others, becoming a chant. Kodomo Sensha, Kodomo Sensha. Tommy's expression didn't change. He had expected this. He had counted on it.
Miguel, he said quietly, fire at will.
The 37mm gun of the M22 Locust had an effective range of just under a mile, but at the close quarters of the ravine, barely 200 yards from end to end, it was devastating. Miguel's first shell struck the third truck in line, punching through the thin metal of its cargo bed and detonating the ammunition crates inside. The explosion was colossal, a pillar of flame and smoke that rose above the jungle canopy and would be visible for miles.
The laughter died instantly, replaced by screams.
From their elevated positions, Morrison and Peters raked the convoy with methodical precision. Each shot was aimed, calculated, deadly. Trucks erupted in flames. Artillery pieces were hit, their crews cut down before they could even attempt to bring the guns to bear. Japanese soldiers scrambled for cover, but in the confined space of the ravine, there was nowhere to hide.
At the southern end, Williams engaged the Ha-Go in what should have been a fair fight. But the Japanese tank commander, still processing the shock of the ambush, made a fatal error. He ordered his driver to reverse, attempting to flee rather than fight. The movement exposed the tank's thinner rear armor for just a moment.
Williams didn't miss. His shell struck the Ha-Go's engine compartment, and the tank shuddered to a stop, smoke pouring from its vents. The crew attempted to bail out, but Peters' tank, tracking the movement from its elevated position, cut them down with its coaxial machine gun.
In Tommy's tank, time seemed to dilate. He was everywhere at once, directing Bobby to adjust their position, calling out targets for Miguel, coordinating with the other tanks via radio, all while keeping track of the overall tactical situation. It was as if he could see the battlefield from above, watching the pieces move on a chessboard, always 3 steps ahead.
RPG team, 9 o'clock, Bobby shouted.
Tommy spun the turret even before the words were finished. A group of Japanese soldiers had recovered from the initial shock and were setting up a Type 4 70mm rocket launcher, one of the few weapons in their arsenal that could actually threaten a Locust. If they got that shot off,
Miguel fired. The shell exploded among the rocket team, and the threat evaporated in a spray of red.
Good shooting, Tommy said, his voice eerily calm.
"Target front, officer with a sword."
Tommy looked. A Japanese officer had climbed onto the hood of a burning truck, katana raised, screaming at his men to counterattack. It was a brave gesture, almost admirable in its suicidal defiance.
"Machine gun," Tommy ordered. Miguel switched to the coaxial, and the officer fell.
The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than 4 minutes. When the smoke began to clear, the ravine had been transformed into a charnel house. All 17 trucks were destroyed. Both artillery pieces were wrecked. The Ha-Go tank sat smoking at the southern end, a blackened hulk. Bodies littered the ground, some still, some twitching, some crawling desperately toward imaginary safety.
"Cease fire," Tommy ordered. "All units, report status."
One by one, the other tanks checked in. No casualties, no significant damage. 100% mission success. Tommy climbed out of his hatch and stood atop his tiny tank, surveying the destruction. He should have felt triumphant. He should have felt vindicated. All those people who had laughed at him, who had dismissed him and his machine, they had been proven wrong. Instead, he felt nothing, a curious emptiness that would stay with him for the rest of his life.
Bobby appeared beside him. "Hell of a thing, Sarge."
"Yeah," Tommy said quietly. "Hell of a thing."
He was looking at the bodies scattered across the road. Many of them were young, boys really, barely out of their teens. They had laughed at his tank, called it a child's toy, and now they were dead. All of them. Every single one.
They underestimated us, Bobby continued, as if reading his thoughts.
Yes, Tommy agreed, and that's why they're dead. Never underestimate anyone, Bobby. Never laugh at what you don't understand, because one day it might be you lying in the road.
He took one last look at the carnage, then dropped back into his tank. "All units, prepare to move. We have more work to do."
Over the next 3 weeks, Tommy's platoon became the most feared unit in the Philippine theater. They struck without warning, appearing from impossible directions, destroying targets that should have been invulnerable, and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Japanese commanders began reporting attacks by phantom tanks, machines that seemed to materialize out of thin air, wreak havoc, and disappear like ghosts.
The nickname Kodomo Sensha, child tank, which had begun as an insult, became something else entirely. It became a warning. Japanese soldiers who had once laughed at the tiny tanks now spoke of them in hushed, frightened tones. Guard duty on supply convoys, once considered safe, became a death sentence. Soldiers began refusing assignments to convoy escort duty, and commanders were forced to implement harsh punishments for cowardice.
None of it helped. Tommy and his crew continued to hunt.
The second major engagement came 12 days after the first, on a coastal road where a reinforced convoy was attempting to reach the front lines. This time, the Japanese had learned from their mistakes, or thought they had. The convoy traveled with multiple tank escorts, infantry patrols ranging ahead and behind, and motorcycle scouts providing early warning.
Tommy defeated every precaution. He had spent days studying the route, identifying a stretch of road where a cliff on one side and a steep drop to the ocean on the other created a natural choke point. He positioned his tanks not on the road itself, but offshore, hidden among the rocky outcroppings at the base of the cliff. When the convoy passed, he emerged from the water, a tactic so unexpected that the Japanese scouts never thought to check for it.
The attack came from behind. The first the convoy knew of the danger was when their rearmost tank erupted in flames, struck by a shell from an impossible angle. By the time they turned to face the threat, Tommy's tanks had already reversed back into the rocks, invisible again.
He repeated the attack twice more, each time from a different angle, each time withdrawing before the enemy could bring effective fire to bear. The convoy, unable to see its tormentor, began to panic. Vehicles crashed into each other as drivers attempted to flee. Soldiers abandoned their posts, running in random directions, some of them straight off the cliff into the ocean below.
When Tommy finally emerged for the killing stroke, the convoy was already destroyed, not by his guns, but by fear. He simply finished what terror had started. "How do you do it?" Captain Morrison asked later, reviewing the after-action report. "These tactics, I've never seen anything like them. It's like you're reading the enemy's mind."
Tommy shook his head. Not their minds, sir, their expectations. People see what they expect to see. They expect tanks to be big, to attack head-on, to fight in conventional ways. So when something small attacks from an unexpected angle, using unconventional tactics, their brains can't process it. They freeze, and that's when they die.
That's remarkably cold-blooded, Sergeant.
War is cold-blooded, sir. I didn't start this fight, but I intend to finish it.
As December progressed, the legend of the Kodomo Sensha grew. Japanese prisoners captured by other units spoke of the phantom tanks with a mixture of terror and superstitious awe. Some claimed the tanks were piloted by spirits, the ghosts of soldiers killed in the Bataan Death March, returning for revenge. Others believed they were a new secret weapon, transported directly from America by dark magic.
The truth, as it so often is, was both simpler and more complex. There was no magic, no supernatural force, just a man who had been underestimated his entire life, who had finally found the perfect tool to prove everyone wrong.
December 18, 1944. Intelligence reported a massive Japanese convoy preparing to move, the largest supply shipment of the campaign, carrying desperately needed ammunition, food, and medical supplies to Japanese forces defending Leyte. If the convoy reached its destination, it could extend the battle for weeks, costing thousands of American lives.
High Command wanted an airstrike, but the route passed through dense jungle, invisible from above. They wanted an infantry assault, but the convoy was too heavily defended. Over 300 soldiers, multiple tanks, and at least a dozen machine gun positions.
In desperation, they turned to the Kodomo Sensha.
"This is a suicide mission," Captain Morrison said bluntly, delivering the orders. 4 light tanks against an entire battalion? Even you can't pull this off, Chen.
Tommy studied the intelligence reports, his eyes tracking over the maps and photographs. He was silent for a long moment, his crew watching him with the faith of disciples awaiting a prophet's verdict.
"We can do it," he finally said. "But not alone. I need support. Indirect fire, timed precisely to my signal. Can you get me that?"
Morrison hesitated. "Artillery support is committed to the main offensive. I might be able to scrounge up a mortar battery, but—"
Mortars will work. I need them to target specific coordinates at specific times, not where the convoy is, but where it will be. Tommy's finger traced a line on the map. Here, here, and here. The enemy will try to retreat through these routes. If we seal them with mortar fire at exactly the right moment, we can funnel them into a kill zone and finish them.
That requires perfect timing. If the mortars are even 30 seconds off,
They won't be. I'll make sure of it.
Morrison looked at the young sergeant, this small, quiet man who had accomplished the impossible so many times that it was almost becoming routine. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why do you keep doing this? You've proven yourself 100 times over. You could transfer to a staff position, train other crews, let someone else take the risks."
Tommy was quiet for a moment. "When I was a kid," he said finally, "my father owned a small restaurant in San Francisco. Every day, white soldiers would come in, and some of them would mock him, mock his accent, his size, his food. He never said anything, just smiled and served them their meals." He paused, his eyes distant. After Pearl Harbor, they came and took him away, interned him, along with thousands of other Japanese and Chinese who looked like the enemy.
"He died in that camp, Captain."
A heart attack, they said.
Morrison was silent.
He never got to prove them wrong, Tommy continued. Never got to show them that he was as American as they were, that his size and his accent didn't determine his worth. But I can. Every mission, every victory, every time I do what they say is impossible, I prove them wrong. Not just for me, for him, for everyone who's ever been laughed at.
He stood, folding the maps with precise, deliberate movements.
Set up the mortars, Captain. We move at midnight.
The night was moonless, which suited Tommy perfectly. His 4 tanks moved through the jungle like shadows, their engines throttled down to near silence, their crews communicating in whispered radio messages. They had trained for months for operations exactly like this one, but the stakes had never been higher.
The convoy was camped for the night in a clearing about 3 miles ahead, expecting to complete its journey the following morning. Scouts reported that the Japanese were confident, almost relaxed. They had heard of the Kodomo Sensha, but they believed, with the arrogance of the powerful, that their overwhelming numbers made them invulnerable.
They were wrong.
Tommy's plan was audacious, even by his standards. Rather than attack the convoy on the road, he would strike the camp itself, catching the enemy while they slept. The initial assault would create chaos and panic, triggering exactly the response Tommy anticipated: a retreat down the 3 available escape routes, where the mortar barrages would be waiting.
It was a plan that required perfect execution. Any mistake, any delay, any miscommunication would be fatal.
At 03:45, the tanks reached their assault positions. Tommy paused, taking a deep breath, centering himself. Through his periscope, he could see the Japanese camp, fires burning low, sentries patrolling with the casual inattention of men who expected no trouble, rows of trucks and artillery pieces neatly arranged for the morning's journey.
All units, he said quietly. Final check. Report ready status.
One by one, the other tanks confirmed their readiness. Bobby's hands were steady on the controls. Miguel's eye was pressed to the gun sight. In the other tanks, his fellow outcasts, his brothers, waited for the order that would change everything.
Execute on my mark, Tommy said. 3, 2, 1, mark.
4 37mm guns fired simultaneously, and the night exploded into chaos. The first shells struck the parked tanks, 3 Type 95s and 1 larger Type 97 Chi-Ha, the most dangerous threat in the convoy. The Chi-Ha's ammunition detonated, creating a fireball that illuminated the entire camp and killed a dozen soldiers standing nearby. The other tanks, caught by surprise, were destroyed before their crews could even reach them. Tommy's Locust surged forward, breaking into the camp itself. It was insane, suicidal, a single light tank among 300 enemy soldiers. But that was exactly what made it effective. The Japanese couldn't believe what they were seeing. They froze, stunned, as the tiny tank roared past them, its machine gun cutting down anyone in its path. "Contact right!" Bobby shouted, and Tommy spun the turret, destroying a truck that had tried to start its engine. Another explosion, another pillar of flame. Infantry forming up, 2 o'clock. Miguel switched to the coaxial and raked the soldiers with fire. They scattered, the formation dissolving into panicked individuals.
The other 3 Locusts had entered the camp now, following pre-planned routes that crisscrossed the clearing, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it impossible for the Japanese to organize any effective resistance. It was chaos, pure and absolute, and Tommy was its conductor.
Blue 2, shift fire to the artillery pieces. Blue 3, cover the western exit. Blue 4, hold the eastern approach.
Orders flowed from him like music, each command precise, each maneuver executed flawlessly. The camp was being systematically destroyed, its defenders killed or routed, its supplies consumed by spreading fires.
And then, exactly as Tommy had predicted, the survivors began to flee. Not standing to fight, not attempting to organize, just running, desperate to escape the nightmare that had descended upon them.
They ran straight into the mortar barrages.
The first shells landed at 03:58,
precisely 13 minutes after the initial assault, exactly when Tommy had calculated the retreat would begin. They landed on the northern road, where the largest group of survivors was fleeing. The explosions were devastating, tearing through the packed mass of soldiers with terrible efficiency.
The second barrage came 30 seconds later, blocking the western route. The third, covering the south, landed 10 seconds after that. Every escape was sealed, every route blocked. The survivors were trapped in the camp, surrounded by burning vehicles and advancing tanks, with nowhere to run and no hope of salvation.
The battle, the massacre, lasted another 17 minutes. When it was over, the convoy was destroyed. Every truck, every artillery piece, every tank. The casualty count would later be confirmed at 287 Japanese soldiers killed, with another 43 captured, many of them wounded. American casualties, 0. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Tommy climbed out of his tank and stood among the destruction he had wrought. His face was blank, his eyes distant. Around him, his crew and the other tankers were celebrating, embracing, shouting with the exhilaration of men who had survived the impossible.
But Tommy didn't celebrate. He stood silently, looking at the bodies scattered across the clearing, the young faces, the outstretched hands, the expressions of terror frozen in death.
They had laughed at his tank. They had called it a child's toy. And now they were dead, every last one of them, killed by a weapon they had refused to take seriously.
Sarge? Bobby appeared beside him, his face concerned. You okay?
Tommy was silent for a long moment. We won, he finally said. We proved them all wrong. So why doesn't it feel like victory?
Bobby had no answer. Neither did Tommy. But as he climbed back into his tiny tank, he made himself a promise. When this war was over, he would never touch a weapon again. He had proven what he needed to prove. Now he just wanted to go home.
The destruction of the convoy broke the back of Japanese resistance on Leyte. Within 2 weeks, organized opposition collapsed, and the island was secured. The Kodomo Sensha had accomplished what entire infantry divisions could not, and the brass, the same officers who had mocked the M22 Locust as a washing machine, suddenly developed a keen interest in its capabilities.
Tommy was summoned to MacArthur's headquarters, where the general himself pinned a silver star on his chest. The citation praised his extraordinary heroism and tactical genius, and newspapers across America picked up the story. The Chinese-American sergeant who had proven that size didn't matter, that determination and ingenuity could triumph over any odds.
It was everything Tommy should have wanted. Validation, recognition, proof that he was as good as anyone, better than most. The men who had laughed at him now saluted him. The officers who had dismissed him now sought his advice.
But Tommy felt hollow. The faces of the dead haunted his dreams. Japanese soldiers, yes, enemies who would have killed him without hesitation, but also young men, far from home, dying in a war they probably didn't fully understand. He had killed so many of them, so efficiently, so coldly. What did that make him?
A hero, Bobby said, when Tommy voiced his doubts. It makes you a hero, Sarge. You saved American lives. You shortened the war. You did what needed to be done.
Did I? Or did I just become the thing they accused me of being? A ruthless killer, as cold and mechanical as the tank I drove.
Bobby was quiet for a moment. You know what my grandmother would say? She'd say that every person has 2 wolves inside them. One wolf is evil. It is anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other wolf is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith.
Which wolf wins?
The one you feed, Bobby said. You did what you had to do in war, Sarge. But the war's almost over. Question is, which wolf are you going to feed now?
Tommy thought about that for a long time, and slowly, gradually, he found his answer.
After the war, Tommy returned to San Francisco. He used his military savings and his veterans' benefits to buy a small piece of land in the Oakland Hills, where he established a school, the Chen Academy of Mechanical Arts. He taught young people from all backgrounds, Asian, Black, Hispanic, white, how to work with machines, how to build and repair, how to create rather than destroy. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. When asked about the decorations displayed on his office wall, he would simply say, "That was another life. This is who I am now."
Bobby Washington became his partner in the venture, handling the business side while Tommy focused on teaching. Miguel Santos returned to Texas, where he started a family and eventually became the sheriff of his county, the first Mexican-American to hold the position. They stayed in touch, the three outcasts bound forever by what they had experienced together.
Once a year, on December 18th, the anniversary of the final battle, they would gather at Tommy's home. They would drink to their fallen enemies, to the young Japanese soldiers who had laughed at a tiny tank and paid for that laughter with their lives. They would remember the war, not with glory, but with sorrow and a determination that such things should never be necessary again.
"Do you ever regret it?" Bobby asked, on the 20th anniversary of that terrible night. Tommy looked out the window at the lights of San Francisco, the city where he was born, the city his father had loved, the city that had taken his father away and eventually welcomed his son back.
Every day, he admitted, but I don't regret proving them wrong. I don't regret showing the world that a small man in a small tank could do what no one believed possible. I wish there had been another way to prove it.
"There wasn't," Miguel said quietly. "That's the tragedy. In war, there never is." They sat in silence for a long moment, three old men remembering their youth, the distant echoes of gunfire and laughter mixing in their memories. "To the fallen," Tommy finally said, raising his glass. "To all of them, on both sides. May we never forget what we did, or why we did it, or the price that was paid."
"To the fallen," Bobby and Miguel repeated. And somewhere in the silent archives of history, the story of the Kodomo Sensha waited. The tale of a child-sized tank, the man who mastered it, and the enemies who laughed once and never laughed again.
Thomas Chen died on March 15, 2001, at the age of 82. He was survived by his wife of 53 years, his 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and thousands of students who had passed through the doors of his academy. At his funeral, the American flag was folded with military precision and presented to his family, and a bugler played taps while men and women of all ages, mechanics, engineers, entrepreneurs, wept openly.
Among the attendees was a small group of elderly Japanese men, former soldiers, who had heard the legend of the Kodomo Sensha, and in the decades after the war had sought out its commander. They had expected to find a boastful warrior, proud of his kills, eager to relive his moments of glory. Instead, they found a gentle teacher, a man who spoke of peace and understanding, who welcomed them as brothers rather than former enemies.
One of them, Hiroshi Tanaka, had been a supply officer in the Philippines. He had not been present at either of the convoy ambushes, but he had seen their aftermath, the twisted metal, the burned bodies, the expressions of terror, and yes, laughter, frozen on dead faces. For decades, he had wondered about the man behind those attacks, the ghost who had terrorized an entire army.
Now, standing at Tommy's grave, he understood. The ghost had been just a man, small, underestimated, determined to prove his worth. Not a monster, not a machine of death, but a human being who had done terrible things because terrible times demanded them.
"We laughed at you," Hiroshi said softly, his English accented but clear. "We called your tank a child's toy. We thought you were not worth fearing." He paused, his old eyes bright with tears. "We were wrong, about all of it. But perhaps Perhaps that is the lesson. To never laugh at what we do not understand. To never underestimate those who seem small or weak. To see the warrior inside the man, not the size of his weapon.
He bowed deeply, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of a debt finally paid. Sleep well, Sergeant Chen. The battle is over. The laughter has stopped. And in the end, it was you, the small man in the small tank, who had the last laugh after all.
The sun set over the cemetery, casting long shadows across the grass. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, the ghost of Thomas Chen smiled, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet peace of a man who had finally found his rest.
His story was over, but its lessons would endure.
Never laugh at what you don't understand.
Never underestimate the small, the weak, the overlooked.
And never, ever mistake the size of the weapon for the size of the warrior who wields it. Because sometimes the child-sized tank is the most dangerous of all.